Afternoon, folks. Welcome. We're just letting folks sign in. And if the fair housing team could let me know, am I introducing or are we being introduced? I missed that point. Arjun, if you know, let me know.
No, I think you can introduce yourself, actually, Doug.
Okay.
You've had some practice of this recently.
All right. So shall I start us, John?
It's 2:00. Why don't we
All
go
right.
for it? Yeah.
Thanks very much. All right. So I'm going to share my screen first, and then Arjun, you will share yours and walk us through the meat of the presentation. Arjun, can you just verify that my screen can be seen?
Yeah, looks good to me.
All right, welcome. So thanks very much, everybody. We are going to present a discussion, so we get some slides, but we want to have this be a discussion. We hope to get your input and involvement as well, because we want to answer some really deep questions about the sociological impact of evictions on surroundings. And so we're looking at crime, and we're looking at schools and school budgets and scholastic achievement and all kinds of interesting things. And this presentation is going to be a joint effort with Mass Landlords. We provide the data, but mostly Arjun at Brown University is going to be walking us through. And Arjun's also a dual role Mass Landlords eviction data researcher. So that's the plan for this session here. We're going to give an overview about how Mass Landlords has gathered every eviction filed in Massachusetts since January 1st of 2019. And then Arjun will walk us through some cutting edge methodology to look at the impact of evictions and to determine whether we can measure a statistical impact on certain outcomes. And then we're going to have a discussion really about education data sets and what's the best way to approach this problem. And I'll just say up front, we don't have answers yet about the education question, but we have a really good methodology. And so that's where we hope your input will help us go in the next direction. Just a couple prefatory notes here. Neither I nor Arjun is an attorney, and when we talk about the law, we're going to be providing a lay explanation of legal process, but if we get it wrong, just speak up and correct us, and we'll look into it. And this work is really, it's a senior thesis at the moment. It has not yet been peer reviewed, but it's headed in that direction. So just keep that in mind as important context. Arjun, anything you'd like to add by way of introduction before I talk about the mass courts data gathering effort?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll introduce myself before I begin presenting, but no, really excited to get started here. So thank you all for coming.
Okay, super. So let's talk here about how we've done. Whoops, it would help if I pressed next instead of end. I apologize, everybody. Let's talk here about how we have gathered eviction data. And this is not a secret process. If you have your own jurisdiction outside Massachusetts where you're interested in gathering eviction data, maybe you can learn from what we've done. And if you are in Massachusetts, I want you to know that this data is available to you as well, with very limited restrictions. We just don't disclose names of parties, but otherwise there's a lot that's to be shared here. So let me just set the stage here, because you've read the name Mass Landlords and you're probably curious, why has a landlord trade association invested in data gathering, especially about evictions? And the answer is we want housing policy to work. We're a grassroots member-funded organization, and we're the long tail of housing providers. So a lot of people who operate stick frame construction, small buildings. The average landlord has 19 units. The median is 9. So half of our members have very few rental units and don't have professional management. And there's been a lot of interesting work done recently on how small landlords are sociologically oriented differently towards our renters. We know them, we pull packages in out of the rain, and of course we don't want to lose our customers. And so that's really where Mass Landlords has come to fund this work, because it's actually a pretty tough climate out there. We've got a large majority of landlords doing their level best to provide safe and affordable housing. But I mean, the whole point of this conference is that there needs to be more enforcement and better enforcement in housing in particular, because there are a lot of bad actors who operate with impunity. And that's not our members, but it's a problem that we recognize as a shared problem. And a bad actor can really make a big difference in someone's life, especially in the context of eviction, because eviction is the last bump on the road to deep poverty and other really serious adverse consequences, not just in terms of economics, but health outcomes and social outcomes. So if we could eliminate all evictions, that would be fine with us. And that's the goal that Mass Landlords wants to work towards. The housing policy debate is obviously very active, and people will say different things about Massachusetts. For instance, in this Eviction Lab scorecard, we've got 0.5 star out of 5 during the pandemic here, but I think you'll see there's more to it than that. Okay, so let's talk about what policy context we're in here in Massachusetts. We have basically 3 courts that can hear an eviction case. The legal parlance in Massachusetts is called summary process. So I'll explain in a minute, but summary process means it's meant to provide a speedy resolution, because if people don't know where they're going to sleep next month or that night or whenever, it's extremely detrimental, and landlords obviously want to not just rent their space, but there's a time component to it, because if someone is in a space and they're unable to pay for it, the landlord would rationally, economically want to try to replace that customer, but obviously socially, is that the right thing to do? No, the summary process language is just kind of this kind of mealy mouth explanation for what we're trying to do in Massachusetts, which is the eviction process. And the 3 courts that have jurisdiction, as I mentioned, are housing courts, which have 6 districts, which are shown in the map there. Obviously, the smaller the district, the more people there are in the area. So there's an Eastern Division Housing Court that basically does Boston and a couple other towns. And then not shown on the map are the district courts, which also have jurisdiction. There's round numbers, about 100 of those separate. So you can file in housing court or district court. And then in Boston in particular, there's also a municipal court with jurisdiction to hear summary process actions. We have read every single case in all 3 courts filed since January 1st, 2019. And it lets us have this kind of unprecedented insight into what's going on. So for instance, you can look at the different types of housing courts. Those are the main time series. And you can see how many cases are filed in each division by each month. And you can see this big trough where we had a powerful eviction moratorium, a nation-leading eviction moratorium, where you couldn't even file a case unless there was a concern directly related to health and safety of occupants or neighbors. And so that was a very sharp cutoff in eviction filings. And then you see kind of, if you can see my mouse here, there's a spike when the eviction moratorium was lifted. There was an intent to have a rental assistance program in place, but it did not take effect immediately. So filings went right up. And then there was a new program put in place where you didn't have to file an eviction case to get pandemic rental assistance. And that's why you saw filings go down to kind of historic lows, about half of what they were beforehand. So in Massachusetts, the policy response was highly effective. We don't have particular data about it here, but I'll just say filings went down by roughly half. You can sort of see that. And forced move-outs, that means a household was physically removed from the premises, went down by about 90%. And so this eviction moratorium trough gave us time to put that safety net in place. With landlords at the table, we created a safety net that allowed you to get rental assistance without having to go to court. And we reduced filings, and a whole bunch of households were stabilized. So just to summarize that, we've got the pre-pandemic baseline, the moratorium, the rental assistance phase, and now part of what we're doing here with this conference is figuring out where do we go from here. And you can see rental assistance has tapered off. There's a new requirement where you have to move towards court to get it, and so on. So that's what the graph can show us. I want you to know that Mass Landlords is not the only organization compiling eviction data, and the trial courts themselves have got a really user-friendly dashboard up where you can slice and dice the data in different ways from the way we look at it. And so if you're interested in this in a Massachusetts context, you can pull our data from our site, obviously, but you can also go to the trial courts and see it there, and you can compare the two, and you can kind of validate ours and theirs. So before we get into the question about crime in schools, let me just show you exactly what we're doing to pull these eviction cases down in case this is helpful to you, and then also so you understand the data set that we have. In Massachusetts, we're fortunate to live in a state where we have access to public records in the courts. And so we can scrutinize whether the courts are operating fairly, whether rental assistance is working. It's all available for inspection at masscourts.org. Now, for reasons that I think are related to the cost of maintaining servers, we are not allowed to use a scraper, and the terms specifically say you can't use automated methods to harvest data. So what does that mean? It means we've taken our entire team and we've distributed the workload where people are going to each docket in sequence. There's a way to search for them and find them all, and right-click save, right-click save, right-click save, save the things manually. Obviously, we can't do that as fast as a script, and that reduces server load, and I think we meet the terms of the requirements. And then once we've got the software, once we've got the pages saved, we've got in-house software that goes through and looks at all the things saved locally. That's a repeatable process. So we don't modify the original files. We can always go back and reanalyze. This is exactly what the docket said in HTML. That's programmed in Perl 5. is called the practical extraction and reporting language. If we could do it over, if you were building your own, I would advise you learn Ruby instead. It's a more modern language. Perl is kind of older technology. Okay, so we download every file. Actually, we download every file twice because we're concerned with knowing kind of real time how cases are being filed. And we call that the month zero download. So on a regular basis, we're about 10 days behind filings. We look at everything that's newly filed and we can answer preliminary questions like where is the eviction being filed and who's named and that kind of thing. But then we wait 18 months later when we believe that a significant number of cases are now resolved, and we download every file a second time to get a sense for what happened. Did the plaintiff, the landlord, win? Did the defendant win? Were there counterclaims? Did it bounce around between judges? Did the case result in a forced move out, or did the parties mediate and settle? We can do a lot on that second pass. I'll just mention a little bit about the computer-assisted manual analysis here. It's very far from an automatic process, and there are a couple of key inputs that help us to identify whether this particular plaintiff or defendant is really an entity, and also whether this municipality, so-called, is really a village name inside a larger entity. So for instance, in the Massachusetts Convention, a place like Cherry Valley would be written in the legal service of process for the eviction and would appear in the court record. But for the purposes of statistics and analysis, we recognize Cherry Valley as part of the Leicester municipality because Cherry Valley doesn't have its own government or anything. It's similar for a lot of neighborhoods in Boston. You might think of like Charlestown, but that's actually a subset of Boston. Okay, similar for entities, you know, sometimes you just see Kendall. Does that mean it's a Kendall LLC, or does it mean it's someone's last name, Kendall? There's a lot of work that goes into making sure the computer script is doing something sensible. I want to just set the stage here so you understand some terminology that's going to come up in Arjun's presentation in a minute here, and it's going to just take us into the weeds a little bit, so bear with me here. If you're coming from a context outside of Massachusetts, you probably think of eviction in the common parlance as moving someone out onto the street or to the curb. And I want you to know in Massachusetts, that's not lawful. First of all, the landlord is never allowed to touch someone's stuff. That can only be handled by a bonded and insured mover under the supervision of a constable or sheriff and court order. So it's very, very illegal to do what's called a self-help eviction in Massachusetts. And in fact, when we look at what happens in Massachusetts summary process cases, a vast majority of them are mediated. So we have now it's official as of the 31st, the new standing orders in the court. We have a mandatory mediation period, and it requires even second service of process. So you serve the original case, but then you serve the mediation separately. So there's a lot of work that's done to make sure that when parties get into court, there's a resolution, and if it does go to a levy of execution is the term we call it, a forced move out, it doesn't result in people going to the curb. We also have a right to shelter in Massachusetts, where if there are children in the household, they can go that evening and get a hotel room or shelter or somewhere, depending on what's available. Okay, so that's what I've just explained here. The word eviction is pretty unclear as a term. There's eviction filings, which show people trying to access the court. And then most of our data will concern judgments when a plaintiff has been declared to be successful in making their case for possession of the apartment again. And then levy of execution, the forced move out, that's something that's actually harder to track, and it's not really what we're focused on here. We're looking at that middle outcome, the judgments. To tie it all together into a picture to leave you with, this is an outline of the Massachusetts eviction process. And you can have this and look at it, this recording and the slides and so on. There's basically from the moment rent is late to the moment the apartment is ready for another renter. Again, there's an awful lot of stuff that happens in the middle. And what we're looking at here is what's called out in the brackets between the file date and the judgment date. That's the actual court duration. So the notice period is prior to that, and appeals and so on, they're not included in this analysis per se. This is the original file date to judgment. Just to give you a sense for what a mass court docket looked like, we redacted the names, put in fake names here, but you can see kind of, you know, what's the address, who the plaintiff is, who the defendant is, how many are the defendants, how many are the plaintiffs are their attorneys, and then the docket history down towards the bottom. This data set has over 100,000 filings and a lot of outcomes as well, probably about half as many at this point. So it allows us to ask all kinds of interesting questions. And that's where we're going to get into comparing our data set here to other data sets. And Arjun is going to walk us through, first of all, how we looked at crime, which is an easy data set. And then we're going to talk about how we want to look at education, which is a harder data set to come by. Arjun, did I misstate anything that you'd like to correct?
No, everything sounds good to me, Doug.
All right, great. Well, with that, take it away. I will stop my share and you can share yours.
Thanks. Okay. Doug, are you able to see that?
Yeah, it's working.
Wonderful. Okay, we'll get started. So yeah, hello everyone. My name is Arjun Shanmugam. I'm a senior at Brown right now, writing my senior thesis about estimating the effects socially of eviction. And as you can see sort of from the title of this presentation, initially this project was intended to be about estimating sort of the effect of eviction on educational outcomes of kids and on, how eviction affects school funding. As we sort of discovered, that's a very, very difficult problem, and we sort of ran into data limitations. And so the next best thing we felt was to basically come up with what I think is a pretty solid methodology of evaluating the effects of eviction on crime. And what we're going to do is basically apply that methodology to the issue of crime and hopefully come up with some answers today and in the future about how we could further apply that methodology to educational questions as we get more and more data. So yeah, so I'll just go ahead and start here with some more introductory material and some motivation for this project. Then I'll talk a bit about what I've done with the amazing data that Doug has done such a good job of collecting. Then I'll talk about an empirical strategy that I'm going to use to sort of estimate a credible estimate of the effect of eviction on crime. And lastly, I'll go ahead and talk about some results and conclude. So just to start, I want to give a little bit of background about why eviction is such an important issue to study. It is a bigger problem in America than in other rich countries. A recent study from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development found that eviction filing rates are substantially higher in the United States than in a lot of other wealthy countries. And if you've heard of Matthew Desmond, back in 2017, he published the book Evicted, which sort of began this huge research and policy interest in the problem of eviction. He basically, in his book, follows the journeys of some low-income renters across the United States, and basically finds that life is extremely tough as a low-income renter in the United States. And he points out that, most poor renting families in America spend over half of their incomes on rent. And as a result, a huge number of people are basically living on the edge of eviction, which sort of spearheaded this movement to figure out what actually are the social effects of eviction. Sociologists sort of began that research interest, and they found pretty large effects of eviction using what I'm going to call non-experimental methods. And I'll talk more about what that means over the course of this presentation. But basically, these non-experimental methods are things like observational studies, even more complicated statistical methods, such as propensity score matching. And in some ways, these methods are really, really solid, but in others, they are still vulnerable to confounding. And eviction is a problem that is correlated with a lot of different social outcomes, which means that it's difficult to separate what we think are the impacts of eviction from the impacts of other social distresses. Economists are just now beginning to study eviction. And that's a good thing because of the fact that a lot of statistical methods that economists have come up with over the past few years do a better job of approaching what I'm going to call the experimental ideal. Whenever you're trying to sort of figure out, what's the impact of this social intervention or social problem on some outcome, the best possible way, hypothetically, to get at that effect would be to sort of run it like a medical trial. In a medical trial, a treatment is randomly assigned to the treatment group, and then the control group doesn't get the treatment. And then because that treatment is randomly assigned, you know that any difference in the outcome that you observe has to be a result of the treatment. Obviously, we can't do that when it comes to eviction. And so these more experimental statistical methods basically try to come as close as possible to producing experimental estimates like the ones from the medical field that I just described. Like I said earlier, existing estimates from sociology are likely to be confounded. There's something known as an Ashenfelter dip, which we likely observe when it comes to evictions. And what I mean by that is there was an economist named Orley Ashenfelter who was studying the effects of job training programs. But the big experimental issue that he ran into was that before somebody enters a job training program, their social outcomes change a lot. I mean, that's part of why they're entering the job training program in the first place. And so as a result, it's really tough to separate the effects of job training programs from confounding variables. When it comes to eviction, there's sort of a similar problem. A lot of times, somebody loses their job before they become evicted. And so it's hard to say, okay, like, did the eviction cause that job loss or any other social outcome? Or was the eviction a result of that social outcome in the first place? And this is sort of just a summary of why eviction is such a difficult problem to study and why it's tough to understand how it interacts with a host of social outcomes. A recent paper by Winnie Van Dyke, a professor at Harvard, uses some of these more quasi-experimental methods, more credible methods to study eviction. And she does find small effects of eviction on durable consumption, so the purchase of durable goods like washing machines, for example, access to credit, and a host of other outcomes. So like I said, this project began with a focus on education, and I just want to kind of elaborate on why education in particular is a really difficult outcome to study when it comes to eviction. So what I initially was hoping to do was actually to get access to more specific student level data, for instance, student test scores, and link those records to Doug's great eviction data. And then, understand, after an eviction, how does a student's educational performance change? That's an extremely difficult problem, just because there's a lot of privacy concerns, as you can imagine, with educational data sets. And so we're kind of trying to figure out, is there sort of a higher level, maybe at the city or neighborhood or town, at which we can conduct this analysis and still produce a credible estimate? That's one possibility, but yeah, so definitely welcome input there now and as the presentation goes on as well. So basically what we're going to do today is apply this empirical strategy to crime, which is a bit of an easier outcome to study because there are less privacy concerns with using microdata of crime incidents. So there are several potential channels through which eviction could plausibly affect crime. So it could be that eviction weakens community bonds that ultimately discourage crime. And some researchers have documented associations between eviction and the social cohesiveness of a neighborhood. So more evictions make a neighborhood less socially cohesive and actually reduce bonds between individuals that some sociologists theorize discourage crime. It could also be that, maybe evicted tenants are more likely to commit crime after receiving notice of eviction. Or it could be that landlords are evicting tenants who are likely to commit crime. So there are a lot of potential channels at work here. I will give a very brief sneak peek of the results here and just say that what we find is that when you look at an eviction, after the eviction, crime actually decreases in the 500 meters surrounding the property. That obviously is by no means evidence that evictions are a good thing or beneficial for communities. In fact, what I'll argue is that they are still a negative thing for communities. But I just want to keep in mind here that we're just talking about the area in the 500 meters surrounding a property, and we want to understand exactly what's happening in those 500 meters. And so at the end of the day, it's very important to understand the way that eviction is affecting communities in order to really understand what the optimal policy responses are from cities, states, and even the national government. I do want to talk about two other pieces of research here in economics that have studied the relationship between eviction and crime more recently. So Sarah Kroger and Julia Lamatna, two economists, put out a paper basically finding that nuisance ordinances increased the risk of eviction in Ohio towns. And a nuisance ordinance is essentially a law that a municipality passes, which penalizes landlords for crime incidents and 911 calls that occur on their properties. And so the mechanism seems to be that, when a nuisance ordinance is implemented, landlords are more likely to jump to sort of eviction as a solution to problems or crime incidents on their property. And that increases the risk of eviction more broadly. Another economist, Stefano Falcone, he found that evictions do in fact cause crime at the city level, but only under the assumption that nuisance ordinances affect crime only by increasing evictions. As for whether that's a credible assumption, I think it's a little bit unclear, and definitely more research is necessary to understand that. But at the end of the day, that is an assumption that needs to be further tested. So I want to talk for a minute just about the data that we have here. So obviously, beginning with eviction data from mass landlords. And that 50,000 number, I think, is a little out of date now because of the amazing efforts of the mass landlords team. But we have access to things like case outcome data, the name of the judge assigned to the case, the method of case resolution, whether that was mediation, whether the case was heard, dismissed, defaulted, things like that, and a lot more really, really rich information as well. I was also able to find a data set released by the Boston Police Department that basically contains incident level data for every crime incident that Boston Police Department has responded to since 2015. That data set also contains the coordinates of each incident. Something that I do want to highlight, a bit of nuance here, is that we're not necessarily talking about crimes. We're talking about any incident that a Boston Police Department officer responded to. And that's an important nuance to point out because, crimes actually being committed and police responding to some kind of incident are two very different things. And so what we're going to do is basically create a 500 meter radius around every eviction and match to crimes which fall into that radius. That's going to be done using GIS technology. So basically we're gonna, using GIS, create a 500 meter radius around every property. And if a crime's coordinates fall into that radius, we're going to increment that eviction's crime count for that specific month in which the crime occurred or the crime incident was responded to by 1. And so what we're left with is basically this panel data set of every property in Boston which experienced an eviction filing over the time period that mass landlords has been collecting data. And so for every property in Boston which experienced an eviction filing, we can basically observe during every month how many crime incidents police responded to in the 500 meters surrounding that property, which we think is pretty interesting and pretty cool. So just to start digging a little more deeply into the data, I want to talk about some of the variables that we have access to. So I've produced this summary statistics table here. It's divided into different panels that just sort of go through the different variables that we have access to. So to begin with panel A here, we have what I'm going to call pre-treatment outcomes. So the outcome variable that we want to study here is the total number of, or the number of crime incidents that Boston Police Department responded to within 500 meters of each property. So you can see that in this first row, I've calculated the mean change in total crime incident responses within 500 meters of a property between 2017 and 2019. And you can see that there was a small decrease by 158 crimes. In the second row, We have the total number of crime incident responses in 2017 within 500 meters of the average property. And those, again, are going to form basically our outcome variables. In panel B, panel C, and panel D, we have more what I'm going to call pre-treatment characteristics. And these characteristics are all potential controls that we can include in our empirical strategy and in our model to produce better estimates of the effect of eviction on crime. I just do want to highlight a few things here. In panel B, we can see that I've calculated the mean population density of the census tracts in which our properties are located here. You can see that most of the evictions tend to be occurring in very high population density areas. And yeah, so if you look down to panel C as well, these are also, very important variables here. So in this third row, panel C, we can see that 78% of the evictions that I'm going to look at were filed actually for non-payment, which is a very important detail because in Massachusetts, most of these evictions are being filed because tenants are often unable to pay rent. Moving on to panel D, I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the characteristics of defendants and plaintiffs. So we can see that there is a big difference here between the percentage of defendants and plaintiffs who have attorneys in Massachusetts. Those two numbers here, 0.08 and 0.88, they don't tell the whole story. In Massachusetts, it's legally required that if you are an entity involved in a summary process case, you have to be represented by an attorney. So a lot of this huge difference here is actually driven by the fact that a lot of the times in summary process cases, the plaintiff is an entity and thus is required to have an attorney. Nonetheless, the people involved in eviction cases on the defendant side tend to have access to fewer resources and less resources than plaintiffs. And that's an important thing to keep in mind for anybody studying eviction. Lastly here, I just want to talk briefly about some details about the resolution of cases. I think the most important thing and the thing that surprised me the most when I began studying eviction was these statistics here about case dismissal, cases being heard, and cases being mediated. So we can see that a plurality of cases in Boston here are actually decided through mediation. And that's a big deal because it means that in a lot of cases, the judge really isn't involved beyond, the procedural level. Usually in this case, we're talking about a housing specialist working out some kind of agreement between a tenant and a plaintiff. In a lot of cases, those types of agreements can be more beneficial for both parties than letting the case be heard and ultimately judged on. This map right here just plots out visually where the evictions in our data set are located. So you can see that just like the previous slide suggested, a lot of these evictions are occurring in high population density areas and tend to be more common in lower income areas of Boston than in upper income areas of Boston. Okay, now I want to start talking about the empirical strategy that we're going to apply here. And we're going to use something that is very common in economics, and it's called difference in differences estimation. So at a very high level, what we're going to do is, let's simplify this for a second and just suppose that we have two properties, one property where an eviction was filed and was successful, and one property where an eviction was filed but it was unsuccessful, meaning that the defendant ended up winning the case. What we can do is basically compare how much more crime incidents increase in the property where the eviction was successful compared to the amount that they increase in the property where the eviction was unsuccessful. So in this figure here, you can imagine this black line being the timing of the eviction case being decided. And you can imagine this purple line right here being the change in crime incidence within 500 meters of the property where the eviction was successful. And this green line being the change in crime incidence in the property where the eviction was unsuccessful. And so in this dummy example right here, you can see that the slope of the purple line is greater than the slope of the green line, suggesting that, you know, there is an effect of eviction in this simple graph right here, which again, our actual results are going to be a little bit different, but I just wanted to provide some high level intuition for difference in differences estimation here. So again, we're basically just comparing the increase in crimes in the evicted properties to the increase in crimes in the unevicted properties, the properties where evictions were unsuccessful, and seeing how much those increases are different from each other. Just some quick terminology here. You may have noticed that I used words like treatment properties and control properties a lot, which might sound a little weird. This, obviously this terminology is sort of borrowed from medicine, just because we're trying to, again, approach sort of the experimental ideal here. And so treatment properties are going to be basically properties where an eviction was successful. They were treated with the treatment here being eviction that we're trying to study. And control properties are properties where an eviction was unsuccessful. So these are properties which didn't receive the treatment, which again is eviction. Plaintiff judgment here is our independent variable of interest. So this is a variable that is just equal to 1 if a property's eviction was successful and 0 otherwise. And so what we're interested in is the effect on crime incident responses when plaintiff judgment goes from 0, so defendant victory, to 1, or plaintiff victory. And crime incident responses, again, are our dependent variable of interest.
Arjun, if you could just pause there for a minute and go back. I'd just like to make sure, because I did see it in the chat, someone's just hopped on here. I want to make sure we understand here, we're not putting a moral value judgment on treatment. This is a medical terminology applied in the economics field here, where we're just trying to find the effect of something. So treatment doesn't imply that evictions are a good thing. I hope that's clear to everybody. And also, in case you missed it earlier, we're using crime as a shorthand for all police response. And obviously that doesn't mean there's been a conviction or an arrest or anything. We're just using it as a shorthand for, like, if this is a data set of crime, which is actually police responses, what does that tell us about those quantities? So crime is a catch-all term that doesn't really mean something bad has happened. It means police responded, it BPD logged it, it's got a geotag on it.
Yeah, thank you
Yeah.
for the clarifications. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
So this table right here basically just outlines the very different timings of every treatment. So of every last docket date on every eviction case. And so we can see that, for example, in this first row here, June 2019, 43 cases were won by the defendant and 19 were won by the plaintiff. And that represents 0.2% of all cases. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do as we construct our empirical strategy is we need to figure out a good way to decide what controls we actually want to include in our model. So if you notice in this leftmost column here, we have the same first 4 panels from the summary statistics table that I showed you a few slides ago. And what we've basically done is taken all of the pre-treatment or pre-eviction characteristics of properties, and we're going to try to figure out a credible way to decide which one of them makes sense to include in our model as controls. So at a very high level, what we're basically doing here is we have sort of like a regression, and we're going to basically say, okay, when we move the independent variable, which is whether or not the eviction was successful, how much does the dependent variable change? Now, the problem with that is that there might be confounding variables, which are correlated with both the independent variable and the dependent variable. And those confounding variables are problematic because they basically make it so that we can't separate our estimate of the effect of the independent variable from the effect of confounding variables. And so they make our estimates biased or confounded. So what we want to do is figure out which of these variables are correlated with both the independent variable and the dependent variable. And we're going to control for them, because if they're correlated with both the independent and dependent variable, then they must be confounding variables. So every cell of this table basically tries to take a step towards answering that question. Let's just take a look here at this cell right here. So this number 0.00, we can see that the row is total crime incidence in 2017. And so what this number comes from is basically a regression of the independent variable of interest. So in this cell right here, we are regressing the variable for whether or not the eviction was successful on the total number of crime incidents in 2017. And we're reporting the p-value from that regression. So what this number tells us, since it's a very small p-value, is that the total number of crime incidents in 2017 is a significant predictor of our independent variable of interest, which again is whether or not the eviction was successful. If we go one more cell over here, we can see that total crime incidents is also predictive of our dependent variable of interest, or the number of crime incident responses. And so total crime incidents in 2017 is going to be a variable that's correlated with both the independent variable and the dependent variable. And so thus it's a confounder and we need to control for it. I don't want to spend too much more time on this table, but the big takeaway is that we're just trying to come up with a credible algorithmic way of deciding what controls to include in our model. So this table basically takes the controls that we decided to include, and it asks whether we can do a good job of controlling for them and whether we can make the treatment group look more similar to the control group. So we'll start here in panel B and take a look at population density. So this first column tells us that in properties where the eviction case was won by the plaintiff, population density is on average 23,285.5 people per square mile. Now, this column right here, which says unweighted, basically gives the unweighted difference between the mean population density in the treatment group and the mean population density in the control group. And this p-value is basically telling us that that difference is statistically significant. So in other words, the treatment group has a statistically significant difference in population density relative to the control group. Now, if we believe that population density is a confounding variable, then the fact that population density is very different in the treatment group versus the control group means that we have some confounding at play here. So what we're going to do is estimate something called a propensity score model. And a propensity score model just basically takes all of these different variables and estimates a statistical model that uses these variables to predict the probability that the eviction was successful. In other words, to predict the probability that the property is treated. What we can then do is use those predicted probabilities and reweight the control group, basically to make the control group look like a better counterfactual for the treatment group. In other words, to make it look more similar to the treatment group. Because again, when the treatment and control group look similar to each other on observables, then it's less likely that we're going to see confounding. So I don't want to spend too much time on this table here either, but we can see that a lot of the previously significant p-values in the unweighted comparison of the treatment and control group become much, much less significant once we use our propensity score model to reweight observations. And so the takeaway of this table is that we can use these controls to make the treatment group look more similar to the control group and hopefully reduce confounding. Okay, so now I want to talk a bit about results. So the way to interpret this table is this figure right here. So let's just look at month 2, for example. So in month 2, we have this black dot, which is at about 2 on the y-axis, and it's at 2 on the x-axis. So we're going to interpret this black dot right here as the treatment effect or the effect of eviction on crime 2 months after the last docket date on the eviction. You can also see that there's these gray lines surrounding every point, and these gray lines are just 95% confidence intervals for each of the black dots, which represent our specific estimates. So these 95% confidence intervals basically give us an estimate of how statistical randomness might change our results. So when we see that these gray lines are not including this black line at 0, then we can conclude that our estimates are significantly different from 0. And so according to this figure right here, the effect of eviction in month 2 after the last docket date of the eviction case is to actually reduce the number of crime incident responses within 500 meters of the property by 2 crimes. Now, that may sound like a lot, so I want to actually contextualize that number just a little bit. If you remember from the summary statistics table, we had, let's go back there for 1 second. We had the total number of crime incidents in 2017 at the mean property was 1,179. And so it's very small relative to this number, but it is precisely estimated. It is significantly different from 0 in a number of these locations. Now, I want to make sure to add a lot of nuance to this finding here. My first thought when I saw these results was, how can it be that eviction reduces crime? Well, that's not exactly true, because again, these results apply only to crime within 500 meters of a property. The effects are also very small. That number 2 that I was talking about earlier, it's only 1.5% of the mean monthly crime within 500 meters of a property. And there are a couple of possible explanations here for how eviction could reduce crime within 500 meters of a property. One explanation is that during the pandemic, evictions in Boston and Massachusetts became less common. And so only the most sort of determined landlords proceeded with eviction. And so in some sense, the population of people who were victims of eviction may have contained people who were more serious offenders. That's one possibility. We can see that mean court durations also increased from 30 days in 2019 to 90 days in 2021. And 95th percentile durations increased from 94 days in 2019 to 304 days in 2021. And again, I do want to underline, this does not in any way mean that eviction is good for communities or beneficial. This is more a statement about the social distress and the social climate faced by individuals who are victims of eviction. And it is very possible that eviction could drive up crimes in other areas of a city outside of that 500-meter radius of the property. As I said earlier in the presentation, eviction tends to be associated with large decreases in social cohesiveness, things that many sociologists believe are actually important for preventing crime. One important question that I think needs to be asked is, where do victims of evictions go once they experience eviction? So some anecdotal evidence says that individuals who are victims of eviction tend to couch surf with relatives and friends and family. And another study, some research actually done by Doug and his associates at Mass Landlords, finds that 1% of the defendants in our eviction data are actually named as defendants twice in the same year. And so a lot of these individuals, unfortunately, are repeated victims of eviction. So what I think we've done a good job of doing here is sort of providing a proof of concept for further investigation into the role of eviction and education and how those two things interact. Again, crime was not the original goal here. The goal was sort of to create an empirical framework that could be applied to understand the effect of eviction on other areas of life and other social outcomes. One further area of research is definitely to better understand and investigate people who are most affected by eviction. And from a policy standpoint, I believe that this research shows the importance of supporting individuals who are victims of eviction and shows the importance of further investigating the effect of eviction on crime outside of the 500-meter radius of our property as well. Yeah, so at the end of the day, these results are interesting. They're far from, peer-reviewed and conclusive. So I welcome feedback, comments, and hope that everybody has things to say as well about this research going forward. But thank you so much.
Thanks, Arjun. So I'll just address some questions I see in the chat here that have been raised, and then we'll turn to folks if you want to unmute yourself and make a contribution. I can also screen share a Word file that we have to take some notes if you have questions about this presentation for the next time we give it, or if you have thoughts about getting and using educational data or other data sets. And I think, Arjun, I think we can be encouraged because I see Gwen comments in the chat most recently. I'd be interested in how eviction disenfranchises voters. And so that's basically the idea with this. This is a very new methodology. You can take this approach that Arjun's developed and you can ask different questions. So if you have a data set on voter registration, for instance, and you can look at it, and connect it somehow to the eviction data set, then you can ask that question about disenfranchisement. Correct me if I'm wrong, Arjun.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I think that Gwen raises a really, really interesting question there. I mean, we know that over the past few years, in a lot of Republican states in particular, there's been an explosion of really restrictive voter ID laws. And, it's really scary to think about the interaction between evictions and those voter ID laws. If somebody doesn't have a place to stay, it's hard to think about the second order problem relative to housing that is voting. And at the end of the day, that takes away people's political voice, and it's a really, really huge problem. So
yeah,
we'll have to apply the methodology to that.
And we already know there's lots of research on how unstable housing situations can have a dramatically adverse impact on health outcomes. So it's the question of how do you get the data set to match up to the eviction data set, I think is really the only thing that's unclear. We have a couple questions from Pamela, which maybe are landlord related. But so it looks like you're saying you're the pro se plaintiff in Worcester Housing Court, and you're trying to get the case dismissed or closed 5 years after you moved out. So Pamela, maybe you could explain, you're the landlord or the renter in that situation?
Yeah, this is super interesting to me. So thank you for this. I'm sorry that I had to arrive late. I was the plaintiff pro se, and Worcester is a big housing court. I had 4 lease violations, and I was so driven by restraining orders, protecting myself in district court, that judge said, you need to go to housing court. So I did it, going for protection, what they call a TRO. I got so screwed that it ended up being a commission against discrimination case. I mean, I really was in grave danger. And so I moved out and became homeless. So after the fact, I paid $3,000 to a good attorney who said, let's tell them you're leaving. Let's close this case. She didn't like some illegal things. And she's warned me, you may lose your $3,000. We could get thrown out of court. That is exactly what happened. $3,000, my loss.
Well, I'm sorry to hear this, Pamela. It sounds like this is a situation particular to you. And if you'd like to be connected with someone who can help, let me just offer you, maybe you could email us at hello@masslandlords.net and we'll follow up with you after. I'm not sure it's the most relevant for our discussion here about data methodologies, because it sounds quite particular to your case.
Well, I don't think I can close it because it's an open meeting law violation, and I just got my hand slapped even again. So I
Okay.
really don't know if I want to get the PTSD that goes, but thank you.
Well, I'm sorry to hear you're going through that. I've put our public email in the chat there, and you can email us at hello@masslandlords.net, and we can point you to a resource that may be helpful. All right, and then Christina asked a question about which cases are included in the eviction case successful group, and I tried to answer that in chat, but maybe Arjun, you could explain that kind of verbally here. So what constitutes a successful eviction using the medical treatment terminology that we're applying here?
Great question, Christina. So we're going to start by just dropping all cases which were mediated. It's not obvious from the data, who could be considered as having won or lost when the cases are mediated, because a lot of times, because those are by definition landlord-tenant agreements. So what we do is we'll count default judgments and judgments against the plaintiff as tenant victories, and we'll count dismissal. Did I say that right?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, okay, sorry. And then we'll count dismissals as victories for the defendant, along with judgments in favor of the the defendant as victories for the defendant. Yeah. So it does include, just to be specific to the question, it also includes default judgments and dismissal judgments, but not mediation.
Thank you. That's better than what I put in the chat there. Okay, and then we have a question from Patrick about how was the data broken down or collected. We did go through that earlier on. If you were here from the beginning and you have a specific question about saving of the dockets, maybe you could try to ask your question again, and we could try to approach that more specifically. All right. Arjun, maybe we could open it up here. Does anybody work in education and have access to a data set in Massachusetts that would line up to this so that we could kind of cross tab it? I'll ask that very specific question first. Feel free to unmute yourself if you prefer, or you could type into the chat. Okay. We expected kind of there to be muted silence there. Does anybody have any suggestions for how to get a geocoded data set on educational outcomes or school funding or scholastic achievement or something like that?
I have a quick question. Sorry, I didn't chime in earlier. Do you collect data that's specific or veteran centric?
No, the mass courts data would not indicate if there was the so-called military affidavit. A landlord who files a case has to assert whether they know someone is protected by veterans protections and active service member protections, and those are federal regulations. And there's some state protections as well. So it is there in the court data in theory, but at a mass courts public level, we can't see that. You need to have attorney access to go through on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, because I know a lot of veterans utilize the HUD-VASH program.
Yep.
And would there be any data on how many individuals that utilize that program, their eviction rate?
Well, so that's if you have access to a HUD-VASH data set, that's the kind of thing we can bring into the mass landlords data set and do a comparison. So we could, if there were an understanding about how the results would be confidential still, we could actually do a name by name comparison. More probably if the HUD-VASH data set were addresses only, we would easily be able to match addresses to our data set. But so coming from the point of view of mass landlords, we have the eviction data set. And what Arjun has done is he's gone off and pulled in the Boston police data set. If you have access to a HUD-VASH data set, that's the kind of thing that we would want to have a connection to pull in. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, okay.
Hi, this is Pamela. Can I ask one question? I was just at Beacon. I just was at the State House yesterday, and a woman was talking about how many times she's been evicted. So her 10-year-old daughter has changed schools due to being unhoused 6 different times. She cannot read, not one word. And this woman was given testimony. So in terms of evictions and shattering lives of students, no matter what the age is, I just wanted to point that out. I mean, the trauma that a person goes through for one eviction, and then when Aran was talking about numerous people have the same experience. I mean, you're so traumatized. This woman was asking at the State House, has anybody contemplated suicide? It's so
Yeah.
traumatic.
Well, this is why we're interested in this. Arjun, maybe you could explain a little bit about how you approach Boston Public Schools and what their concerns were, and how you might want to approach a district or something like that in the future, because this is a real problem what you're bringing up, Pamela, and what we want to work on.
For sure, yeah, and thank you so much, Pamela, for sharing that experience, because it is something that can be extremely traumatic. And part of the reason that we were interested in studying this from the beginning is because, young kids are obviously the next generation. And so if eviction is affecting their educational outcomes, it's just scary to think about what's being left on the table, what, maybe a student could have done or would have accomplished if they didn't have to deal with being a victim of eviction. So thank you for bringing that up. What I had done sort of last summer was I spent a few months just reaching out to a number of school districts across Massachusetts. I started with Boston Public Schools and was basically hoping to link student level educational records to mass landlords eviction data using, for example, addresses or even last names or something like that. And there were two chief concerns there on the part of Boston Public Schools and the other school districts. I believe I reached out to Worcester as well, for example. The first concern was obviously privacy, which should, be put first and foremost. Protecting the privacy of students who are involved in any study needs to be a #1 priority. But because of the importance of privacy, the data merge between student educational records and eviction records would probably need to be done in-house at the school district, which hypothetically we would work with. Which again, totally makes sense. And that's, kind of a problem in the sense that we have a sense of how we want to match different educational records with eviction, but it's hard to say exactly how a school district might do that and how it might be different. So that'd be problem #1. And then problem #2 is just the difficulty of matching student records at the individual level with eviction records. It could be that a student has a different last name than the defendant listed in the eviction case, despite living in the house that experienced an eviction. It could also be that, sometimes, and actually this is something that I was told by people at Boston Public Schools, is that a lot of times students' addresses are not at all up to date. And so the eviction address listed in a case might not even correspond to the address listed in a student's academic record, which also makes it really tough to match student data to eviction data.
Yeah, it's a hard problem. I see Jamie. It's great to hear from you, by the way. Jamie, I see you've asked if we've looked at the directory of data sets and reports. Maybe you could be more specific about what we're missing, because that sounds interesting, but I don't think we have. Arjun, have we?
No, I don't think so.
On mass.gov, there is, and I believe, I'm just looking at it, it's called the Directory of Data Sets and Reports. It's DESE, and it is at mass.gov. It says, explore publicly available data sets and reports from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education by category. There are a lot of different programs that you can look at. And I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, what's your end goal? What are you trying to either prove or disprove in, is this the best way to get there? For me, I know, all of these schools have different scores. You're looking at test scores. I think, to drill down into someone's personal records, I just think that's not going to happen, right? So what's the alternative, and how do you get to where you want to go? So I guess I'm looking to see what is the goal of the research? What are you trying to prove or disprove?
Yeah. So thank you for that. I mean, I think as far as goals go, I think the goal is just to understand how eviction affects students' abilities to succeed in school. So I mean, I totally see where you're coming from as far as individual personal records go. And it may be that that's just not a realistic goal to get access to personal records. The reason that we were kind of shooting for that originally is because it's easier to sort of get past confounding variables when working with individual records than it would be to maybe use like a school level data set or a town level data set and maybe just compare like average test scores across the town when there are more and fewer evictions or something like that. So that's kind of what our goal was and why we were focused on getting access to individual level data. But yes, like I said, that might be something that's not possible. And definitely we'll take a look at this data sets and reports to see if there's something that's more aggregated that could serve the purpose too.
Well, let me just offer this as well. And Doug, by the way, it is good to see you as well. It's always a pleasure to be in your company. Let me
Likewise.
say this. There are, you would have access through, and maybe you need to think of it this way, is the Freedom of Information Act. You may be able to gain certain types of reports. But again, I think they may be public. I'm not sure that you're looking in the right place. And I've been out of this area for a while and looking at this type of data to try to come up with it. But let me say two things. One, tomorrow at the beginning session, the opening session, I'll do another fireside chat with a gentleman named Jeffrey May, who does a lot of GIS mapping. He's big in the data. He's a data geek. And we should put you in touch with him. He may have some ideas on how you might be able to kind of, look at that. But I also want to think about this. We when we're looking at this mapping and trying to figure out, what's the impact of evictions on education, on crime, it really is, all of the ways in which people quality of life is impacted. All right. And so what's I guess for me, I'm still trying to figure out, what is your end goal? Is it just to say that, an eviction would have an impact on a child's education? I think we could almost say, anecdotally, the answer would be yes, right? It's
Yeah.
hard because you're moving from school to school, and then you'd have to know that, right? Did they stay in the same school? Was there a break in their education? Part of that has to be factored in, but there are other things, and so I guess I'm wondering, is that a detail that's really important? Can we just assume, for the sake of argument, that in fact it's true that anyone who has a break in education doesn't have consistent educational opportunities? But that goes deeper than that, right? Because inside these houses of eviction, so to speak, there are all of these other contraindications of things that are happening. So people are getting evicted. Were they getting evicted for violence, right? Drugs in the house. We kind of have to know some other things, because those change things. There's one thing about somebody not being able to pay the rent. It's another thing because there's domestic violence, that's happening. Domestic violence is going to have just as much, if not more, an impact on somebody's educational opportunities and pursuits, just because of what's happening there. So when you're looking at this, I worry that you're going to try to draw something that has way too many other components into it. And if you drill down, it may say something, but does it really say that? Because again, I think, you're talking about somebody who's being evicted doesn't have the financial means to stay there, right? So it's the money first. So, when we're looking at the money, what are all the things that come as a result of that? And,
Right.
are we looking, and then you're saying people are, if they're couch surfing, are we talking about families? Are you saying that they're couch, is one family moving in with another family? And how does that, impact? So I just want us to kind of pull back. I know you're going deep in the dive, but sometimes pulling back also is just as important. And I would, argue that if you look at the Kerner Commission report, I think it was done in 1968. You could pull it out today, put a new front page on it, and it's the same document. You wouldn't know the difference of when that research was done. It is so eerily similar to what's happening in this country today.
Yeah. Thank you for all that Yeah, you're exactly right to point out that there's a whole lot of issues here. I guess speaking for my part, and Arjun, you can jump in if you want to add something. I feel like we are really close in Massachusetts to having a really good framework for housing stability in the context of helping kids grow up successfully and have good education. For instance, we have that right to shelter component, but the right to shelter component is not a right to school district component. And so a lot of times right to shelter ends up relocating families far beyond where they want to go. And so if you had a clear signal that said, look, education is really impacted by evictions, it's possible to reimagine that program in a way where right to shelter is really, and the kids get to stay in their same school district, keep their friends and so on. Obviously that requires more of a commitment from the Commonwealth, but that we've got a really good foundation here. And similarly, there's a lot of federal programs that will provide a voucher for certain neighborhoods of opportunity. There are different acronyms in different parts of Massachusetts for what that program is called. Like in Greater Springfield, it's called Seeking Neighborhood Opportunity, or SNOW-MASS. And that's another example where if we have a good educational picture that says, this housing first solution is really important, not just for homelessness recovery, but also for making sure kids have the maximum potential. It really informs a broader policy response, I feel like. So sometimes just asking a basic question, like, can we know for sure that education is impacted by eviction? It kind of opens up the possibility to better policy. That's our thought.
Somebody was not on mute.
Yeah.
Let me suggest this too as an alternative then, is to be looking at grants to study this in a way where you would then have access maybe to a small group that you could then follow. There are, and grants not just necessarily that are born out of the state or the local government, but out of foundations. So I would be looking at like a Ford Foundation. I'd be looking at Soros. There's a lot of different foundations that you can take a look at that are interested in, children's welfare. And I know that there are a couple that are in that region that you're talking about. And their names escape me, but I would also be looking there because they may give you access to things because you're doing a particular study. You may be able to get an entrance that way as well.
Really interesting idea. If you could actually track households, if you could track folks over time, that would be really powerful.
Absolutely. And I think that's going to help make the case that you're trying to make, right? Is what does it look like? And it's great that there are these programs out there, but we also have to look at the efficacy of each program. Right. And I hear what you're saying. So thinking about that and also looking at those programs and other data that's already out there that's looking at programs of that nature. Who else is studying it? So again, I think this is wonderful, and I'm so glad that people are tuned into this kind of thing, because we need to do more data gathering, not less, right? And we need to start making those connections so that we understand the impact. And I've always said this about this particular conference, is that it was doing just what you're talking about right here, is to have a conversation and show how housing impacts education. It impacts life, quality of life issues. We know from housing that we can tell what your, your zip code, we can tell your health outcomes. Health outcomes can be decided by this. Educational opportunities determine what your employment opportunities are going to be. So this is exactly what we should be looking at. And so I want to thank you for bringing this. It's kind of dense material. It's you got to be in it. Us geeks like this stuff. But I also want to make sure that everyone's getting what it is that's trying to happen here. Sometimes we, the convolution of the words that we use takes away from what the message is. And I want to make sure that there's a strong message that you are trying to make change and look at things in a way that we can create a real holistic suite of services to ensure that those who are on the fringe of housing opportunities get drawn in, and that we can create a better system and ultimately change the trajectory of the lives of especially these children in our communities.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. That's well said. It's about the future. Yeah. Okay. I still have a couple of questions in the chat. I guess I want to just try to address here. And Christina asked one, asked about, where did it go? Have you thought about looking at the data from the perspective of school location rather than housing location? For instance, could you look at schools within a certain number of evictions within their district? Are we able to tease out any data from that, do you think?
Yeah, so I can answer that. That's a great question, Christina. So actually, before I began this thesis, I looked at I did kind of an analysis similar to the one that you're suggesting. What I basically did was I took average reading and math proficiency rates in cities across my home state of Ohio and compared to basically like looked at how those reading and math proficiency rates changed depending on the number of evictions in each city. And that's a very intelligent empirical strategy to use, and it's very intuitive to just say like, okay, let's see how these things change as how student outcomes change in a city or a district as the eviction rates change. The only issue with that is that it is sort of tough to control for confounders. So we can add a number of controls, right, to a model that sort of works in the way that you described, and we can control for certain things. But we can only control for confounding variables that we have data on, that we can observe. And so you can imagine there might be confounding variables on which we don't have data. And so in that sense, that might be a shortcoming of sort of the method that you described relative to something that is more quasi-experimental. Does that sort of make sense? Did I answer that question or?
I hope so, but Christina, if you feel you didn't, feel free to unmute or retype. Okay, so Christina also asks, as a fair housing advocate, I typically view the filing of the eviction case itself as a harmful action, a harm-causing action. Have you thought about using no eviction case filed as a control? Why did you look at only cases that have had an eviction filed?
Yeah, that's another really, really good question. So I did think about potentially doing that. So what Christina is suggesting, just to make things crystal clear here, is that rather than comparing properties where an eviction was filed and successful to properties where an eviction was filed but unsuccessful, why don't we compare properties where an eviction was filed to properties where an eviction was not filed? I believe is what Christina is asking. And that's also something, a very intelligent proposal. And I think I would probably consider it, maybe a direction for future research more than anything. And the reason that I chose not to do that in this study in particular is because when you are comparing properties where an eviction was filed to properties where no eviction was filed, those two types of properties are very, very, very different. We know from sociological research that properties which are targets of eviction attempts tend to be very, very different and located in very, very different and often more socially distressed areas than properties where evictions were not filed. So in other words, what Christina is proposing would result in a treatment group which is very, very different from the control group. And there again, that sort of increases the opportunity for more and more confounding to occur. Because that proposal would basically make the treatment group look even more different than the control group. And so the reason that I chose to use the treatment and control groups that I did choose to use is because there's less of a difference in observable characteristics between properties where an eviction was filed and successful and properties where an eviction was filed but unsuccessful. And I think Christina's raising her hand here.
Yeah, go ahead and unmute if you'd like to.
Yeah, well, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'm just trying to sort of think about, right, like if you're experiencing issues getting the data that you're feeling like would be the best data, right, which is like per child educational outcomes, right? I mean, I think one way that's sort of like the thinking, right, the direction I was heading in when I was thinking about how else to look at this. And I think too, like when you're talking about the the difference in terms of neighborhoods that are most impacted by evictions and the neighborhoods that have the least number of evictions, right? I mean, I would imagine that there'd be a way to sort of control for that, right? So if you're looking at, I mean, I don't know, I'm not a data scientist like at all, but I would imagine that there'd be a way to sort of control for those differences, right? When you're looking at sort of you know, properties and the ratio of properties that don't have evictions filed, and what the educational outcomes are in those neighborhoods
Yeah.
compared to those that do.
I mean, I think we can run the analysis is the question of where the error bars go. And so it's hard to get them not to touch zero. Arjun, go ahead.
Yeah, so that is also a really good point, and we can control for a lot of the things that you're describing. So for example, like if two neighborhoods are very different in terms of their eviction rates, they might also be different in terms of income. And we observe income and we can control for that. But like imagine a situation where, for example, maybe in neighborhood 1, landlords are just much more sympathetic to tenants than they are in neighborhood 2. That's not something that we can really control for because we don't really have data on that. And so in that sense, those what are called unobservable confounding variables, we would not be able to control for using that methodology, but we can get, 80-90% of the way there in the way that you're describing.
And then Christina, you also suggested that excluding all cases that resulted in an agreement for judgment, which is Massachusetts parlance for a mediated outcome, probably excludes a lot of successful evictions. And we know for sure that that's true because oftentimes what happens is a landlord and the tenant will mediate, and part of that agreement will be the tenant has to leave. And so that would count as a successful eviction, but that's a data issue. We just don't know what the agreement said, not at the level of 100,000 cases. You need attorney level access to look at each case on a case by case basis to read the information contained in the uploads.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And something that I do want to mention as well is that, a lot of sociologists estimate that for every formal eviction that occurs in America, there's another sort of informal eviction that doesn't even go through the courts. We can, debate about the exact accuracy of that figure, but informal evictions do happen in the United States. As Christina pointed out, successful evictions are probably also occurring in some sense through the mediation process. And as Doug mentioned, in some ways that's a data issue that we can't really go beyond, but it's important to keep in mind as we do this research.
Yeah. And Maria suggests in the chat, a lot of people are evicted just because they don't have a lease. The landlord wants to raise the rent or whatever. Eviction is not always about something the tenant did wrong. And that's true. There are in Massachusetts as well, you can file what's called a no fault eviction where the landlord doesn't have to present a reason to the court. But I guess it's just important to remember that the longer the eviction process gets, the more difficult it becomes, the more seriously you have to question why the landlord would go that route instead of what you're describing, Arjun, which is a less formal eviction where they pay the renter to leave or negotiate a move out or something like that. And so eviction in court doesn't always mean the renter did something wrong, but there is potentially something to that. And of course, the policy framework makes a great difference as well, because as we saw last fall in Massachusetts, they started to require that a landlord issue a notice to quit for a household to be eligible for rental assistance. That's the first step of a court process, and that's harmful. And that didn't go through notice and comment here. And so it's an example of where having a clear data picture that's communicated to policymakers could result in better outcomes. We didn't have that in that moment, and so we have a worse outcome now. So that's a long answer to your question, Maria. I agree with you. Yeah, being in court doesn't indicate that someone did something wrong.
For sure.
All right, we have just a few more minutes here. Are there any other questions for Arjun and his work? Any other thoughts about how we can get education data? And we will look at the mass.gov site. Okay, then maybe we should wrap up here and give you back a few minutes before the next section. John, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, just very briefly, there is no more next session. That's the good news.
Oh, my mistake.
Yeah, no, when we do this one in person next year, we will have more interesting stuff happening in the evening. Perhaps I'll get together for a drink afterwards and talk about how the day went. This year, though, we're still virtual, so it's to everyone's private initiative as to how they want to celebrate the end of the first day. We have 2 days to go, and I'd like to really thank you, Arjun. Thank you, Doug. I think this is particularly important that we continue to have these situations too seldom do I see, since it's somebody with if you will, a foot in both camps in some ways, it feels too infrequent for me that I see people who are primarily working with, well, tenant-related issues and fair housing issues and so forth, and rental property owners and managers sitting down together and really trying to talk about things that really are common problems, and really how first of all, we can really get a clearer idea of what the data is that we're dealing with, which really happens very, very little in these situations. And once we have that, perhaps how we can better deal with this in the future. So thank you both. Thank you, everybody, for the first day. Jamie is co-founder of this series. Do you want to say anything real quickly?
Yeah, I just said it before you got there and before you came back in. So I think
Okay.
they've heard from me. But again, thank you, everyone. It was a great first day. It's great always seeing Doug. And I can't say that enough. I think the same thing. Mass landlords getting together, trying to solve some problems that impact the people that they're also having to work with, the landlords, is a really good thing. And that should tell you you are lucky if you are living in Massachusetts. Doug is doing everything he can. And he's thinking of approaches beyond what is the standard. And he certainly can't solve all, but the fact that he's jumped in with both feet and that he shows up here and tries to give us that information and to work with us is again, it's exceptional. So thank you, Doug. Thank you, Arjun. Great job. And hopefully you all will see more of that and at least hear some of that tomorrow in our opening session with Paul May, who does that GIS mapping for HUD. And maybe there again is a connection for you as well. So thank you all, everyone. Have a great day. Enjoy the rest of your day. And we'll see you back here again tomorrow at 9 o'clock.
Day one down, 2 days to go.